And I'm also starting my presentation with a disclaimer, which is that my contribution is not directly related to Lucia Moholy. In fact, I will only briefly mention her now in this introduction. But instead, what I want to focus on is the context of a specific photographic practice which intersects with her work and offers a new way of understanding part of her work in conversation with that of other women photographers, which is so-called social photography and its networks in interwar Central Europe. So I argue that a consideration of photography at this nexus of activism and modernist visual representation can help us to extend how we understand women's contributions to photography with a specific focus on social activism as a field that opened up a space between modernist experimentation and social engagement, deeply embedded in collaborative social and political networks. To truly grasp the depth and breadth of women's contributions to modernist photography, we must consider the dynamic and interconnected ways their work engaged different photographic genres. Their involvement in diverse networks, driven by personal friendships and connected through political and artistic affiliations, underscores the need to look beyond individual contributions or institutional affiliations. Accordingly, I will focus on two photographers today and how their contributions to modernist photography shaped and were shaped by social photography as a network-based Central European practice. And those two photographers are Irena Blühová and Judit Kárász. Both were born in the Hungarian part of the Habsburg Empire and grew up in eastern Czechoslovakia and Hungary, respectively. And their biographies have gained some attention in the last decades in relation to their studies at the Dessau Bauhaus. But much remains to be said about how they mobilize different strategies as social photographers and activists. And taking this into account, my presentation tries to sketch out some key points in their activities that build on notions of collectivity as an intrinsic part of their photographic practice. So this is just to show also how long they were actually in communication with each other. Blühová and Kárász first met at the Dessau Bauhaus in 1931, where they studied photography with Walter Peterhans. But studying together was only one formative aspect of their time in Dessau. Another one was politics. They were active in the Kostofra, the communist student faction, which was closely connected to the Dessau branch of the Communist Party. They helped in publishing the circular letter Bauhaus, and they helped to disseminate the Weimar Republic's most successful leftist illustrated magazine, die Arbeiter Illustrierte Zeitung. As a part of the Kostofra, Blühová and Kárász also took part in local protests organized by the Kostofra in combination with the Communist Party, and with other Bauhaus students such as Ricarda Schwerin, supported the activities of the International Red Eight in collaboration also with workers from the Dessau Junkers factory. So while their main objective of studying at the Bauhaus was to receive an artistic education that in Blühová's own words would help people and shape a better future, it is also clear that this education cannot be thought of separately from their social and political commitments. Indeed, these activities also determined the length of their stay in Dessau. After candidating for the Communist Party in the local election, Kárász, alongside Ricarda and Heinz Schwerin, was expelled from Saxony-Anhalt and moved to Berlin, where she worked for the Defort press agency. I'm also working with Robert Kappa, so it's all connected. Blühová left in the same year, returning to Bratislava, where her bookshop Blü printed and disseminated communist material connecting party activities in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Germany, and Austria. So in this sense, the Bauhaus represents a touching point that on the one hand offered a formal artistic training, but it also helped to lay foundations for an activist network of which printing, typography, and photography were a central part. In an interview given in 1983 about her studies at the Bauhaus, Blühová described it as a school that created humans to become human. Blühová's comment is not only indicative of the central importance she ascribed to photography and modern printing technologies, which she hoped the Bauhaus would help her improve, but it also encapsulates the essential aspect of her broader photographic practice, which accompanied her since her early years as a photographer. the exposure of social injustice in some of Central Europe's most disadvantaged regions. A closer look at how this human element was essential in social photography thereby connects Blühová and Kárász to each other and with like-minded photographers from Central Europe. As their manifold activities at the Bauhaus indicate, rather than acting alone, their work must be understood as part of a more comprehensive network in which the human was not only present in the resulting images, but also manifested in the very practice of photographing, publishing, and exhibiting together. Based on volunteer work, which activists would conduct in their spare time and at their own expense, the social photography movement was based on informal networks across Central Europe. Combining ethnographic interests, modernist viewpoints, and a connection to party politics, social photography produced activist documents in the works of Matthew Witkowski, closely entwined with contemporary politics and the social engagement that tied images to their locations of origin, while also standing in perpetual dialogue with international developments. A central feature of social photography was that it was not a solitary pursuit, but a collective activity which avoided setting individual photographers at the center in favor of joint representation. As such, exhibitions as well as publications in leftist magazines such as DAF, As Ut, Tworba, and the Arbeiter Illustrierte Zeitung remained anonymous or in the group's name, making it difficult to determine the authors of individual photographs. The social dimension of social photography thereby not only built on a specific mode of production in series and documentary photographic essays, for example, which captured the lives of social outcasts and impoverished members of society in a realistic yet sympathetic manner. It was also closely embedded in youth movements, making sports and rural tourism core foundations of how the movement developed in the region. As Blühová emphasized, for example, before she decided to study at the Bauhaus, it was an enthusiasm for alpinism and her involvement in communist youth organizations from a young age onwards that got her out of her hometown and led her to her first encounters in deprived areas that would become the focus of her activities. Involved in activist groups such as Sociophoto, which she co-founded in Bratislava in 1934, the agitprop theater group Dielna, and the youth association Charlot, Blühová's activities were strongly defined by collective efforts that built on Central Europe as a shared cultural space. Andreas Haus has connected Sociophoto to the activities of Lajos Kossak and his Munka Circle in Hungary, for example, in which a group of young photographers produced reportages of impoverished rural areas. Supported by another leftist association, the Austrian Friends of Nature, or die Naturfreunde, the Munka Sociophoto group exhibited in Budapest, Vienna, and Bratislava in 1932. Meanwhile, connections between Sociophoto and the Naturfreunde in Bratislava existed through figures such as Karol Aufricht, then a young photographer who would credit his development as a social photographer primarily to Blühová. Branching out into different directions, by the 1930s, a range of groups in Central Europe collaborated or referenced each other through links on different levels, and photographers such as Blühová and Kárász played an essential role in disseminating their ideas. Blühová and Kárász's shared outlook in this context is well illustrated in reference to two groups, Charlot and the Szeged Youth Art Club. I apologize the terrible translation for the Hungarian speakers. So Charlot was originating in the Scout movement in Bratislava in 1925, and it initially represented the interests of the Hungarian minority in Czechoslovakia and sought to preserve Hungarian identity beyond political borders with various cultural programs. By the late 1920s, Charlot became more defined in its left-wing politics and increasingly focused on documenting the impoverishment of rural communities, which involved them even more closely with the social photography movement. Blühová participated in the photographic activities of the group early on, joining like-minded photographers such as Rosie Ney, who by that time was already living in Paris but would return to Czechoslovakia and Hungary on extended trips to villages and homesteads in eastern Slovakia and Subcarpathian Ruthenia. The participation of internationally active figures merged calls for international solidarity by progressive figures with close engagement with local contexts. In other words, the networks Blühová was involved in through social photography underline that a global Bauhaus connection that is often positioned at the core of her practice in terms of her international connections was only one aspect of her activities, which were much more multi-layered than long acknowledged. Beyond Czechoslovakia and the Weimar Republic, Hungarian connections played a considerable role. While on the one hand this is emphasized by Charlot, links also reached slightly further afield, bringing the Szeged Youth Art Club into context. Founded in 1930 as a collective of activist students from disciplines including literature, sociology, and psychology, the group's primary motivation was to construct realistic images of the countryside while collecting folklore and ethnographic material. In the summer of 1932, the group organized a photography exhibition by Kárász titled 15 Kilometers from Town to Homestead, which she arranged while visiting her hometown Szeged from Berlin. Even though this setup of having a work of a single photographer in a sociographic exhibition went against the previously mentioned main practices of social photography, Kárász's exhibition was nonetheless framed in close dialogue with developments across the region. 15 Kilometers from Town to Homestead relates to a project by Blühová of the same name, organized as part of a Charlot exhibition in Bratislava in 1931, which focused on a presentation of impoverished villages as victims of the exploitations from the city. As the shared title of the exhibitions in Szeged and Bratislava indicates, the two photographers' political affiliations and close working relationship had a lasting impact on the work upon their return to Czechoslovakia and Hungary respectively. Beyond personal connection, the similar approaches in Blühová and Kárász's social photography show that a combination of shared political interests, artistic training, and engagement in local youth groups helped to construct an aligned imagery of rural poverty in Central Europe. The repetition of subject matter and title in the exhibitions highlight the widespread poverty that the exhibitions were set to reveal. Lacking individual titles, the images in Kárász's exhibition, much like the wide-ranging work of social photography groups in the region overall, were designed to function as a unified message and produce a coherent narrative. So in this sense, a broader view on social photography in interwar Central Europe also emphasizes a fundamentally multilingual and multi-ethnic environment that stood against an increasingly conservative political climate. While research on social photography movements has predominantly been constructed within national frameworks, particularly when tied to rural communities as places of some sort of national origins, organizations such as Soziofoto, the Naturfreunde, and Charlot highlight that such an approach cannot do justice to the international entanglements of social photography at the time. In collaboration, the work of photographers involved in these groups built a shared imagery of rural life and poverty in Central Europe. The activities and influence of photographers such as Blühová and Kárász as activists, organizers, disseminators, and teachers bring to light fresh perspectives on the interplay between art and social engagement in Central Europe. They shift focus on artistic practices that were strongly shaped by women's contributions and interdisciplinary approaches to the medium of photography as a collaborative practice. Recalling Blühová's notion of becoming human, women's contributions to photography in interwar Central Europe ultimately show us a different side of how we might understand photography in the region, moving beyond the achievements of individual artists in consideration of the shared outlook that stood at the core of their practice. Thank you.